Good morning to those in the hearing room and those following us on YouTube. Now, I think we're able to resume with Ms MacKenzie.
Ms MacKenzie, yes.
Good morning, Ms MacKenzie.
Morning.
Right. Ms McGregor.
Thank you. Ms MacKenzie, yesterday we were talking about the general risk assessment that was completed in 2017. So if we start there and then we'll continue to move through the chronology. If I could maybe just ask you first of all to have your witness statement in front of you. So that's within bundle 1 of the witness statements. And if we could look to page 151 and to paragraph 20. And if we just pick matters up at the very bottom of that page, so you're introducing matters and you say, I appreciate that the NHSL risk, and then if we move over the page, assessments were predicated on NHSL having noted that the proposed ventilation arrangements for these rooms was contrary to SHTM 0301 in relation to the pressure regime. That predication would likely have been on the advice of MacDonald. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
And you said yesterday that I think your recollection was that it might have been Colin McRae that had given that advice. Is that correct?
That is.
How certain are you that the advice was coming from MacDonald and Mr McRae in particular?
I'm fairly certain it did, yeah.
And were you having direct discussions with MacDonald, or would that be other members of the project team that would be having those discussions?
I would have been having, some direct conversations with them, and we did about a number of things, so it wasn't always through somebody else.
Okay, because in your statement you fairly say you're not an engineer, you're a clinician, and there's a very clear statement within the risk assessment that there's non-compliance with SHTM 0301. So given that you're not an engineer, is that something that someone would have had to have told you?
Yes, I mean, I wouldn't have said it unless someone had told me it.
Yes. And again, as you fairly say in your statement, you're not sure how it gets in there with the passage of time, but you think it was MacDonald and you think it was probably Colin McRae.
Yes.
Thank you. The risk assessment was refreshed in 2018. Can you remember why was it that you felt a need to refresh the risk assessment?
We were asked to refresh it because there was still ongoing discussions with IHSL around what the solution would be, and particularly in relation to the rooms, because we identified 4-bedded rooms that were essential and then those that were desirable. So we were asked to just relook at that to check that the clinical management team were still comfortable with those decisions.
And again, the risk assessments, they're looking at a need from the clinicians to cohort patients. Is that correct?
and the clinical management team very much were looking at it from a hospital-wide approach as to kind of where they would cohort patients in the hospital.
And in terms of the clinicians, your role in the project, did you think at any point that you were agreeing to derogate from published guidance such as SHTM 0301 in terms of what you were asking for in terms of these risk assessments?
Not in relation, to the pressure. We thought that was the right thing to do. I think the issue was around, the reason, I think as I said yesterday, that the design team for IHSL had said that it was to be positive pressure was the issue of they had classed a 4-bedded room as a general ward, and our view was that a 4-bedded bay was not a general ward. It should be treated the same as a single room, and HFS supported that view as well.
And in terms of the risk assessments that are taking place, is there any discussion at this time around about air changes? So we've talked about pressure, but is there any discussion around about the air change rates?
Certainly not within the clinical teams, no.
And in terms of the clinicians, 4-bed rooms, did you think that you were agreeing to derogate from standards and published guidance in relation to air changes for the 4-bed rooms?
No.
And what about single rooms in critical care? Did you think you were agreeing a derogation in relation to air change rates from published guidance for single rooms in critical care?
No, because I wouldn't have viewed a single room in critical care as the same as a single room on a ward.
Thank you. If we could maybe just look to the refreshed general risk assessments, that's in bundle 6, page 14. So bundle 6, page 14. You see in the top of the document, record of general risk assessment, top right-hand corner, 5th of the 7th, 17, reviewed on the 29th of the 1st, 2018. Do you see that?
Yes.
So when we're talking about the 2018 refreshed risk assessment, this is the document we're talking about.
It is, yes.
Thank you. And we see that the manager responsible is Janice MacKenzie. The subject of the assessment, bedroom ventilation design in 4-bedded rooms, does not meet the recommendations of SHTM 0301, as the current design has the 4-bedded rooms as being positive pressure. Do you see that? So there's still this statement about compliance with SHTM 0301. Is that something that's just carried forward from the 2017 risk assessment, or is this something that's been looked at afresh in 2018?
From my recollection, it was just something that was carried forward.
Thank you. So in the period from 2017 until 2018, no one else involved in the project is telling the clinical team, actually, that statement about SHTM 0301, that's wrong.
No one was telling us that, no.
Thank you. We see the next paragraph in bold. It states, to allow cohorting of patients with the same airborne infections, these rooms require to be balanced or negative pressure. Do you see that?
Yes.
So again, this is really just a reiteration of what you've told the inquiry before. The key clinical requirement is the cohorting of patients. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
We then skip to the penultimate paragraph, and if we pick matters up just 3 lines from the bottom of that paragraph, it states risk assessment highlights that it is essential, in bold, to change the ventilation in 7 of the 4-bedded rooms within RHCYP. It would be desirable to change the ventilation in 6 of the 4-bedded rooms within RHCYP. Do you see that?
Yes.
So again, is this a change? 2017, we're talking about 1 room. Now we're talking about 4 rooms by the time we get to 2018.
4 rooms
in critical care.
No, we never were, it's only 3 rooms in critical care in this one.
3 rooms in critical care.
Yeah.
Thank you. Then we see the next paragraph. The risk assessments have been discussed with the Children's CMT and Infection Control and Prevention, who've confirmed that not having the ability to cohort patients is not acceptable from a patient safety perspective. Do you see that?
Yes.
And then step 1, if we just look to the final paragraph, C, separate risk assessments. So again, there's the separate risk assessments for various spaces within the hospital. Step 2, that's made clear again, C, separate risk assessments. And then step 3, the general precautions. It said isolation rooms have positive pressure lobby, which acts as an air curtain and also a HEPA filter to prevent the transfer of airborne infection from the corridor into the room or the room of the corridor. See that? So
Yeah.
Specific mention of isolation rooms. And then we see the summary of risk by wards. The final box there, RHCYP, critical care, 1 4-bedded room, low acuity, HDU, B1, and then over the page it says 063. Do you see that? So
Yes, just needs to go over the page.
if we just move over the page,
Yep.
onto page 15. So it's saying there's 1 4-bedded room, low acuity. So I think that was the original that we saw
Yes.
from 2017. And then we see it continuing, and 3-bedded room, surgical neonates, B1065. Do you see that? So is that the additional rooms that are now going to have to go in?
No one, yes.
And although it says, is that 3 4-bedded rooms it's referring to?
No, so in surgical neonates, they didn't have one 4-bedded bay. They only had 3 beds in that room.
3 beds in that room. Okay, so although it's saying 3-bedded, it is one room with 3 beds.
Beds in it, yeah.
Thank you. And then on page 15, if we look to the bold heading, summary of risk by wards, it says RHCYP, critical care, 4-bedded room, intensive care, B1009. Do you see that?
Yes.
And then if we move down, summary of risk by wards, second box there, we see RHCYP, critical care, no change to high acuity, 4-bedded room, B1031. You see that?
Yes.
And if we look on to page 18, please. The department here for this risk assessment is RHCYP, critical care B1. Do you see that?
Yes.
Then below that, the subject of the assessment, ability to cohort patients within critical care unit. And then step 1, what are the hazards? Clinical risk is still relatively high if no cohort area available, and therefore operationally to retain the ability to cohort within B1063 low acuity and B1065 surgical neonates is essential, and it would be clinically and operationally desirable for B1009 intensive care. Do you see that?
Yes.
And then if we look to step 3, again, we've got critical care B1, 24 beds, 1 time 4-bedded room, low acuity, and 2 times 4-bedded bays, intensive care and high acuity. Do you see that?
Yes.
Okay. Do you have any recollection of whether this risk assessment, the one from 2018, whether that was sent to or discussed with anyone from Mott MacDonald?
I honestly can't recall if it was.
If we could look on, please, to Bundle 13, Volume 5. Bundle 13, Volume 5. And page 1243.
Thank you.
So at this point in the chronology, we're just a few days on from whenever you completed the refreshed risk assessment. Mm-hmm. And if we look to the email in the middle, so the one from Dorothy Hanley to Janice MacKenzie, copying in Graeme Greer and Brian Curry on the 1st of February 2018, you see that it says, my comments and addition of rationale column for Janice's additional / amendments. Do you see that?
Yes.
And then if we look down to see the document, we look to page 1244. See, it's a document, top left-hand corner, it's Mott MacDonald. It's headed up RHSC and DCN, multi-bedroom, 4 beds, ventilation extracts from the IHSL environmental matrix. Do you see that?
Yes.
So was this a document that you'd been commenting upon?
From my recollection, we were asked, it had been populated, and we were just being asked to check that the information around the rooms that were to be essential and the rationale were correct.
And can you remember, it's a Mott MacDonald document. Can you remember why at this point in 2018 are Mott MacDonald creating this document and sending it to you for comments?
I don't recall why they were.
If we perhaps just look at the document, and it's really the second box down, the one B1 PICU and HDUs that I'm interested in. So if we could perhaps just zoom slightly in on that. Because there's a document produced by Mott MacDonald where it's got the department as the main box, There's the code for B1 that they've inserted. Again, can you just remind us, what was your understanding of what the code B1 meant?
The B1's critical care.
Okay. So B1 means critical care. Then next to that, the department says PICU and HDUs - 24 beds. What was your understanding of what PICU and HDUs meant?
So PICU is Paediatric Intensive Care Unit and HDU is the High Dependency Unit, but they were one department, and that was just a categorisation of how the beds were split within the unit. But we were very clear in the clinical output specification that the beds all had to be treated the same as critical care beds to allow us flexibility.
Okay. So although it's been called PICU and HDU, your understanding is that in shorthand that still means critical care?
Yes.
Then if we look to perhaps just take the first two entries in the boxes as we look across, we see that there's multi-bed wards for room B1009. It's going to have natural and central supply, 4 air changes per hour, extract of 1.7, relative pressure of positive. Compromise from the 24th of February is described as essential. The draft for the first of the second states would be very useful but not essential for current planned operational use, may compromise future service development needs. And then in terms of the rationale, it says operationally cohorting within this area is impractical due to number of access/egress points, a number of persons using through corridor. Do you see that?
Yes.
What did that mean?
It was how that particular 4-bedded bay was designed. It was in the middle of the unit, and it had a number of ways that you could go in and out of it. So from an infection risk, you wouldn't cohort patients in that because it would be really difficult to manage the kind of entry and exit points.
Thank you. And then we've been looking at B1009. If we could perhaps just look a couple of lines down, we see entries for B1063 and B1065. Mm-hmm. We'd perhaps just scroll over to the left so we can see the right-hand side of that. Again, for both B1063 and B1065, we see central supply and extract, 4 for the air changes, and then 3 for the extract. One's positive, one's described as balanced. Again, from 2017, it's essential, still essential. And then the comments for the first one are, patients with same respiratory illness will be cohorted to ensure ease of observation and safe care. Do you see that?
Yes.
And then the next one down, preterm babies with the same respiratory illnesses will on occasion need to be cohorted to ensure ease of observation and safe care. Do you see that?
Yes.
So again, are the comments really just reiterating what we see from the clinical risk assessments, that there's these spaces, you're setting at the end why the rationale is there from a clinical perspective, and we see other information, technical information in relation to air changes and pressure rates. Is that correct?
Yes.
And in terms of the air changes and pressure rates, is that information that you would be populating as a clinician?
No, absolutely not.
So who would NHS Lothian be relying upon to correctly populate that type of table?
I would have assumed that this would have been Mott MacDonald's because it was their document.
Thank you. And certainly at this point, is anyone from Mott MacDonald having a discussion with you as a clinician and saying some of the values that we see in this table for pressure and air change rates, they're wrong and they don't comply with SHTM 0301?
No, there was never any discussion.
If someone had raised that with you and said, I hear that you want to cohort patients, if you want to do that and it has to be balanced or negative pressure, you're going to have to derogate and not comply with published guidance SHTM 0301. What would your reaction have been?
I would have wanted more information about that. We would have discussed it with infection control, and we would have wanted a better understanding. We would absolutely have taken advice from infection control. I suspect we also would have taken advice from HFS and from Ronnie Henderson as well.
And is that because in terms of those parameters, you're a clinician and you know what you want to achieve, But can you make a determination in terms of what you would like clinically is going to be, inverted commas, safe from an infection prevention and control angle?
I can't from the point of view of kind of air changes. I mean, I think we very much were saying this is what we want to do, and it's for the design team to come up with how we can achieve that, which was, the purpose of the clinical output specifications. We were giving as much information as we could about activities that were happening so that the designers could then design a facility that would allow us to provide the care that we needed to provide.
Thank you. One issue that I'd be interested in terms of your role strategically within the project, the inquiry's heard a lot of evidence in terms of the revenue-funded project and where design risk sat. And as I understand it, NHS Lothian's position was that really with the revenue-funded project, what they wanted to do was put all of the design risk onto the project company. So NHS Lothian would say, this is what we want the hospital to achieve, but the design risk sits with the project company, apart from a term that's been used, operational functionality, so things like clinical adjacencies. Mm-hmm. If that was NHS Lothian's intention in terms of the project, this type of document that's a detailed spreadsheet produced by Mott MacDonald setting out air changes, pressure rates, we seem to be quite a long distance away from operational functionality and all of the design risks sitting with project codes. Is that fair?
Yes, I think it is fair. I mean, I can't recall why this particular document was Mott's decided to do. I don't know.
And can you recall from your involvement in the project how matters got to this point, from the start of the project wanting all of the design risk to sit with project companies, simply NHS Lothian says this is what we want and someone else designs it, yet we see by 2018 NHS Lothian's technical advisors are producing detailed spreadsheets with technical information?
I suppose I'm honestly not sure really why. I could only probably speculate in that it was, probably down to because it was becoming apparent that there were quite a lot of issues arising, that it was maybe felt that we needed to scrutinise things a bit more.
So by this point, contracts signed around about 2015, we're now in 2018. On the NHS Lothian side, are there real concerns about the project and the design that's coming back from IHSL and Multiplex?
I think there was definitely concern in a number of areas. It tended to be more technical issues as opposed to the kind of the elements that I was directly involved in relation to the kind of the planning of departments and room layouts and things. I mean, there were some issues there, but we were usually managed to resolve them in discussion. But I think I was aware that there were, other issues that were kind of going along and that people were unhappy with.
And if we take this dispute as an example, there's a dispute effectively in relation to the pressure regimes where NHS Lothian is saying needs to be balanced or negative for these rooms. IHSL Multiplex is saying, no, it doesn't, it has to be positive. What level of confidence did NHS Lothian have in the design that's coming back from IHSL and Multiplex?
I think that's quite a difficult question for me to answer. I think you probably would have to ask probably the people that more directly involved. I mean, I think there, generally there was a feeling of concern about the level of issues that were being highlighted.
The inquiry will hear from Mr Greer from Mott MacDonald later today. His position in his witness statement is Mott MacDonald weren't a shadow design team. They weren't undertaking a design review. It wasn't their job to go through things like the environmental matrix, doing a line-by-line review. Did you ever have any discussions with other members of the project team, so Brian Curry, Mr Henderson, about whether that really detailed line-by-line review should be taking place given the emerging concerns that we've just discussed?
No, I didn't know.
Within 2018, there's a point where there's a principals meeting effectively between NHS Lothian and IHSL and Multiplex to try to discuss whether there's a way that the deadlock could be broken. Is that right?
Yes.
And I think that meeting takes place at the Sheraton Hotel in Edinburgh. Is that a meeting that you attended?
I did attend it, yes.
And can you just explain to the inquiry, what's your recollection of what was being discussed at that meeting?
So what was being discussed at that meeting was, I think, all of the outstanding issues, so issues where a solution hadn't been agreed. There were a lot of people at that meeting, and it wasn't just one meeting. There was a lot of kind of subgroups, so we went to look at a specific issue. So people would go into different kind of forums to discuss a specific issue so that both parties, I think, could hear each other's arguments and what the board wanted to do and what our solution was.
The inquiry heard from Mr Henderson yesterday. He said his recollection of these meetings is the 20 rooms that are in dispute, where the pressure's in dispute, those rooms are being discussed, but his recollection was there wasn't any discussion about those rooms being in critical care. Do you have any memory of that?
No, I don't. I mean, I do recall them being discussed, but it was around the pressure regime.
And is the discussion taking place solely in relation to the pressure regime? Is there any discussions taking place in relation to air changes per hour in those spaces?
No, not that I recall.
And was there a broad in-principle agreement that was reached on the 20 rooms in dispute at that principals meeting?
I think it's kind of quite difficult to kind of, because there were so many discussions, but I think there was a general, we were getting there. I don't know that we completely had reached agreement by then, but I think we were beginning to get there.
But at some point, either at the meeting or in the period thereafter, there's a broad agreement that is reached in terms of what the ventilation parameters should be for the 20 rooms in dispute.
Yes, I mean, there was agreement on that. I think then it became more kind of commercial issues around, whether or not that should be a board change or it was for IHSL.
And in relation to the pressure regime for those 20 rooms, what was the agreement?
So the agreement was that they needed to be balanced or negative pressure.
Thank you. And at that meeting, on the NHS Lothian side, is anyone from Mott MacDonald attending those meetings?
Yes, Mott MacDonald were there, yes.
Can you recall which individuals were there?
I'm sure Graeme Greer was there. I think it might only have been Graeme. There might have been a couple of other people came for specific. In fact, I think they did. I think some people did come.
Thank you. There's a variety of meetings that take place after this period, so after the meeting that takes place at the Sheraton Hotel or the period thereafter when there's sort of broad agreement. Just to give one example, if I could ask you to have in front of you, volume 13, bundle 2, page 1246. Volume 13, bundle 2, page 1246. This is a meeting a few months after that meeting takes place, and it's called an M&E workshop. You'll see that there's Ken Hall, Stuart McKechnie from Multiplex and TUV Sud. It's 3 individuals from Mott MacDonald, Camille Kowajacek, Douglas Anderson, Colin McRae, Ronnie Henderson attends, and then there's another individual from Multiplex. Nobody from the clinical side or infection prevention and controls at these meetings. Do you know what was being discussed at these types of meetings that take place from the 12th of April onwards?
I mean, not specifically. I mean, I would have if there had been a particular issue then that kind of needed clinical input, then the practice was they would come and ask either myself or one of the clinical commissioning managers, but without kind of knowing the detail of what was being discussed at them. We certainly didn't routinely get any notes or anything from them.
Okay, so at this point there's technical people looking at technical solutions, but we don't have clinicians or infection prevention and control attending the meetings. Is that fair?
Yes.
But you say that you would be available if someone needed some clinical input, they could get in touch with you.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'd ask you to look within bundle 10, please, to page 179. This is a document, multi-bed ventilation amendment proposal to achieve room balance. Do you see that?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So it's a TUV SUD document. If we just take a couple of examples, so letter D there, so room reference D, that's room B1063, room E is B1031, room F is B1009. Do you see that in the bottom left-hand corner? Now, if we look on to page 182, there's a stamp with RDD signed by you on the 26th of July 2018. Do you see that?
Yes.
Why were you signing off on reviewable design data?
So the procedure for the sign-off of reviewable design data was that it was usually either myself or Brian Curry who would sign off once it had been reviewed. So the process was anything that came in for RDD would be sent by IHSL to Mott MacDonald. They would ensure that whatever it was sent to relevant people for review. And once that had happened and they were satisfied that there were no significant comments on it, they would then give it either to myself or Brian Curry to sign off. Brian and I tended to split what we would sign off, so I didn't tend to sign off more technical documents because I wasn't involved in any of the discussions. But however, there were occasions when I had to, because Brian Curry wasn't there, I would tend to, for RDD, sign off more of the design plans and documents, but equally Brian Curry would sign them off if I wasn't there. So that was why, but it was being signed off on, predicated on the fact that it had been reviewed and nobody was highlighting any comments on it.
So again, not an independent judgment you're making. Mm-hmm. Other people within the team have reviewed it and are effectively telling you it's perfectly adequate to sign this off, and then you sign it off.
Yeah.
Again, just thinking back to the role of Mott MacDonald, the inquiry's heard evidence that they're not doing a shadow design team role, they're not doing a detailed line-by-line review. But for a document like this, if it starts on page 179, it's 3 pages long. Were you anticipating that this type of document, is that going to have the sort of light touch sampling review that Mott MacDonald address in some of their evidence to the inquiry, or were you anticipating for a document like this that it had been thoroughly reviewed by Mott MacDonald?
Yeah, I would have expected it. It isn't a long document, and also this wouldn't have been well, in fact, looking at the bottom, this wasn't the first time it had been issued, so I would have anticipated it had probably been issued to us a few times for RDD, and it will have gone back with comments and then come back to us.
It's important to stress it's no part of the inquiry's remit to work out the precise contractual obligations between NHS Lothian and Mott MacDonald Limited. What I'm really interested in is, as I understand your evidence, you're saying whatever the precise contractual arrangements, your understanding for a document like this is it's been thoroughly reviewed by your technical advisors, including engineers, before it's presented to you for sign-off?
Yes.
It's perhaps going slightly back in the chronology from the document we've just looked at, but there was the potential for a litigation between NHS Lothian and IHSL. Can you just explain your recollection of where matters had got to and why NHS Lothian were thinking about raising court proceedings?
From my perspective, it was because we couldn't get agreement. I suppose NHS Lothian felt that it should be Project Co in effect that would be paying for that. It shouldn't be NHS Lothian. So it was based on kind of commercial issues.
And in terms of the litigation, you produced an affidavit that would have been provided in that litigation had it gone ahead. Is that correct?
That's correct, yeah.
And NHS Lothian had got to the point that a summons, physical court document had been drafted up. Is that correct?
As I understand, yes.
Can you recollect that? That seems like quite a major step for a public body to be taking. Had there been technical advice that had been received by NHS Lothian in relation to the technical solution that they were saying had to be provided by IHS Lothian?
I mean, I wasn't heavily, I mean, yes, I had to provide an affidavit, but I wasn't heavily involved in the kind of discussions about why we were going down that route. I know that I'm pretty sure NHS Lothian did ask somebody independently to have a look at it, but I don't kind of know the specifics.
So you provide the affidavit effectively from a clinical perspective. You're aware that other things are taking place. There might be things like expert reports, but is that really for other people to deal with? That's not something as the project clinical director that you're heavily involved in?
Yes, I mean, Brian Curry from the project was definitely taking the lead in that.
Okay, thank you. So the inquiry's heard evidence that there's broad agreement reached in 2018, the litigation's avoided, and IHSL really just get on and build the ventilation system. So that has, to all intents and purposes, been broadly built by the end of 2018. Was that your understanding?
Yes.
Do you recollect NHS Lothian receiving a letter from IHSL in relation to the ventilation system and its compliance with published guidance thereafter?
No, I don't at the time. I'm subsequently aware of it, but I don't at the time, no.
Okay. So you became aware of this, but is this further down the line later in the project? You're not aware of it at the time or dealing with it?
Not that I can recall, no.
So it's not a memory test. So if we perhaps just bring the letter up, it's in bundle 4 at page 9. Bundle 4, page 9, it's a letter of the 31st of January 2019 addressed to Brian Curry. And then if we look over the page onto page 10, it says all critical ventilation systems inspected and maintained in line with Scottish Health Technical Memoranda 0301, ventilation for healthcare premises. Construction, all ventilation systems have been designed, installed and commissioned in line with SHTM 0301 as required. Systems are maintained in such a manner which allows handover at actual completion to meet SHTM 0301 standards. Operations, all critical systems will be inspected and maintained in line with Scottish Health Technical Memorandum 0301, ventilation for healthcare premises. Do you see that?
Yes.
Do you remember having any discussions with Mr Curry about this letter and its contents around about the time that it's issued, so in early 2019?
I don't remember having any discussions about it. I do have a recollection that IHSL were being asked to confirm that they had complied. but I don't remember having any discussions.
Perhaps that becomes significant to you later on, but at the time that it's issued, this isn't something that you're sitting down and having meetings with Mr Curry, Mr Henderson and discussing at length?
No.
Thank you. Now, in relation to the settlement agreement, so that formally records the agreement that it is reached during 2018. What involvement, if any, did you have in the drafting of the settlement agreement and the technical schedule in that document in particular?
So I didn't have a huge role other than ensuring that any issues that had been highlighted by myself through the design or by the commissioning managers in relation to the design or any of the kind of more clinical elements were included in it because they were still outstanding, they hadn't been, or they were a compromise.
And in relation to the technical schedule itself, that's setting out the precise technical details, who has to do what is your recollection? Who or which entity was drafting the information that went into the technical schedule?
From recollection, I think it was predominantly Mott MacDonald that were.
If I just ask you to have in front of you Mr Henderson's affidavit, so that is in bundle 3 of the witness statements. And if we could just look to page 288, please, and to paragraph 22. So page 288, paragraph 22, what Mr Henderson says is MML, so Mott MacDonald, IHSL and MPX Multiplex drafted the agreed resolutions to the disputes over ventilation in 4-bed and single rooms that are found in the SA1 technical schedule. Do you see that?
Yes.
So is that your recollection as well? Do you agree with that or disagree with it?
Yes, no, I would agree with that.
But clearly you said from a clinical perspective you were having some input. So can you remember what input were you providing?
So there were some items that were on the technical schedule that still hadn't been resolved. So there was, from memory, there was items around child and adolescent mental health, around sockets. I can't remember if there was something about anti-ligature. There was issues around glazing in an area of DCN and critical care, issue of movement joints being in clinical areas that shouldn't have been. So it was ensuring that those were listed.
Thank you. And still within Mr Henderson's affidavit, if we could look over the page to page 289, paragraph 27, please. So page 289, paragraph 27. Mr Henderson says, we relied on advice from Mott MacDonald in relation to the agreed resolutions. Do you see that?
Yes.
And would you agree or disagree with that statement?
I would agree with that.
If we move forward slightly in the chronology, the inquiry's heard evidence that there came a point in time where there was independent testing that was done by IOM Limited. The inquiry's also heard evidence in relation to the stage 4 HiScribe, which wasn't completed before the building was handed over. So the way settlement agreement 1 worked was building gets handed over, and that happens before the stage 4 HiScribe. But were you involved in the process after handover? Was there an attempt to do a stage 4 HiScribe?
After handover, yes, we had one attempt to do one. We had a meeting with Infection Control about how we were going to do the HiScribe, because there was a recognition that to do just one for the whole hospital would be really difficult. So we divided areas up. So we agreed that we would do one for outpatients, one for theatres and radiology, and then one for inpatient areas. And we did a kind of trial run in, I think it was the April time, but actually it was quite difficult to do because there was still a lot of building work going on. So a lot of the areas that we wanted to look at weren't in a fit state for us to do it. So we kind of, when we did complete the documentation, but we agreed we would have to repeat it.
Yes, and maybe just in terms of some of those interactions with infection prevention and control, if I could ask you to look to Bundle 13, Volume 8, please, at page 2218. Bundle 13, Volume 8, page 2218. Sorry, Bundle 13, Volume 8, page 2218. 218. So this is an email from Alex McMahon on the 17th of June to Susan Goldsmith, Jim Crombie, Brian Curry, yourself, and a number of other people. Who was Alex McMahon?
He was the director of nursing at the time, and he had infection control reported into him.
Okay. And we see him saying, Susan and Jim and others, please see below Donald's comments. Do you see that?
Yes.
And then if we look below, there's various comments from Donald Inverarity and Lindsay Guthrie. If we could perhaps just look to page 2219. At the top of the page, it says, "Hi Alex, I'd expect to see the documentation for Risk 2 made available to the Water Safety Group on June 20th and Risk 1 ventilation information to be made available to the Ventilation Steering Group on 4th July. I would suggest those are the two most pressing issues that we would seek assurance on. In the absence of information requested, I'm not sure that the IPCT can give a realistic assessment of clinical risk." Do you see that?
Yes.
So at this point in time, engagement with IPC, but are IPC really struggling to give a view because the hospital really hasn't been completed to the point that it's cleaned and ready to open?
Yes, and also they weren't, as my understanding was, that they weren't getting the information that they wanted as well around, I mean, it mentions water safety, but also ventilation as well, that they needed so that they could feel comfortable.
And again, we'll come on and look at the HiScribe documentation in a moment, but is that because, again, like we've seen in the SHFN document, it's the partnership approach, the multidisciplinary team, whereby it's not just clinicians or infection prevention and control. You need to draw on all areas of expertise to complete the HiScribe.
Yeah.
Thank you. If we could look on to the draft HiScribe that was completed or partially completed for the project, it's Bundle 5, page 95. Bundle 5, page 95. See at the top of the document, SHFN 30, Part B, HiScribe. And then we see in terms of the HiScribe review team, a range of individuals mentioned. So Lindsay Guthrie, Sarah Jane Sutherland, Ronald Henderson, Fiona Cowan, Dorothy Hanley, and yourself, Janice MacKenzie. Do you see that?
Yes.
And if we look a couple of pages down to page 98. You see questions 4.26 and 4.27. 4.26, is the ventilation system designed in accordance with the requirements of SHTM 0301 ventilation in healthcare premises? Do you see that?
Yes.
And it's ticked with an asterisk, and it says with derogation, 4 air changes per hour, single, risk assessed and approved. Do you see that?
Yes.
What did that mean?
So that was information that Ronnie would have provided to say that we did have a derogation for single rooms that we had accepted to have 4 air changes as opposed to the 6 air changes that were required for general wards.
And at this point, is that making any reference whatsoever to critical care rooms?
No, we didn't. We weren't discussing that, no.
Thank you. And then 4.27, it says, is the ventilation system designed so that it does not contribute to the spread of infection within the healthcare facility? Ventilation should dilute airborne contamination by removing contaminated air from the room or immediate patient vicinity and replacing it with clean air from the outside or from low-risk areas within the healthcare facility. Do you see that?
Yes.
And again, that box is ticked. Why was that box ticked?
That box would have been ticked because Ronnie would have said that, yes, it was, that was compliant.
And again, in relation to the individual members of the team that we've looked at the start, we're now looking at technical information relating to the ventilation system. Is that something that you were able to contribute to, or were you really relying on other people to either tick or cross those boxes?
I mean, certainly it wouldn't have been, I mean, it was actually, I think it was Lindsay that completed the form with us. I mean, who completes the form is a kind of, there's no right or wrong answer to that as long as you're all there. But she would have been asking, it would have been Ronnie as the kind of estates person there that she would have asked that question of, because none of us could have said that the ventilation system was compliant.
Thank you. Perhaps just if we look at 4.26, there's an asterisk next to the tick. And then if we look back up onto page 95, there's 3 asterisks there. One's Lochranza, Heme/Onc ward, one's PICU, paediatric critical care, and then another is DCN, acute care. Do they have any relevance to the asterisks we've just looked at, or do they relate to something different?
I don't think they do. Those were the areas that we went to look at.
Thank you. Not possible to fully complete the stage 4 HiScribe at this point in time because of the issues raised by infection prevention and control. Is that correct?
I think by the whole of all of us who were doing it, it was obvious that we couldn't completely, say that everything was correct. We could for some things, but not for everything, because there was still building works going on, so it wasn't a clean environment.
And in terms of timing, how close are we at this stage to the hospital targeted opening date?
That one there, I think, was probably the April one, and then we repeated them all in May. And there were still some building works going on. There was building works going on practically up until the moment we were ready to move.
And what was the targeted opening date for the hospital?
We were starting to migrate on the 6th, 7th of July, over a period of kind of 10 days.
So should the inquiry understand that in the period April, May, both yourself from the clinical team and everyone else involved in the HiScribe, even at that late stage, they still weren't able to complete and fully sign off the stage 4 HiScribe?
Yes.
Thank you. Now, The next period in the chronology I'd like to raise with you is the point in time where IOM Limited come in and do various testing. Were you involved in the instruction of IOM Limited, or was that for other people in the project
I
team?
wasn't involved in the instruction. I knew we were going to be instructing them and that they were coming, yes.
And did there come a point in time where you were informed that effectively IOM had come in, they had done their testing, and on their analysis, areas in the hospital didn't comply with published guidance, including SHTM 0301?
Yes, I was aware that they were raising concerns.
And whenever those concerns are raised with you, what was your reaction at the time?
I suppose I was shocked at the time that we were in a position less than a few weeks to be moving in, and we were being told that potentially there was a problem.
And again, is that because what you've told us previously in your evidence, you are moving along considering that everything complies with published guidance, and I think you then say it's a shock to be told suddenly at the 11th hour, actually this brand new hospital doesn't comply with published guidance?
Yes.
Do you recall whether there was any explanation that was provided to you by anyone working on the NHS Lothian side as to why IOM had come back and said there's been a fail against the published guidance?
Explanation as in what IOM were saying, or
as in whether it was a shock to other members working in the team or whether it was actually expected?
no, it was a shock to. I think it was a shock to everybody.
If we could look within bundle 6, please, to page 177. Bundle 6, page 177. And it's the email right down at the bottom, the one from Graeme Greer to Janice MacKenzie on the 20th of June 2019. Do you see that? So that's the start, but really the text of the emails over the page on page 178. At the top of page 178. Mr Greer states, the SHTM/SA query relates to the difference in air change rates for the 4-bed rooms and I think isolation suites. IOM commented that air change rates were lower than SHTM requirements. I think it depends how we want the information presented to infection control. A fail on the IOM report that can be explained by the compromise in the SA or a note in the IOM report referring to the SA ? Perhaps worth a conversation with IOM today ? Do you see that? Mm-hmm. What was your understanding of what Mr Greer was telling you in this email? I
think this email was sent to a number of us. It wasn't just sent to me, but I think, sorry, what date was this again?
So it's the 20th of June 2019.
Right, okay. So I think he was kind of querying how this information would be presented, and his focus was on the kind of the 4-bedded rooms. I'm not sure why he specifically mentioned isolation suites, because they were compliant, so I'm not quite sure what the significance of that was.
SHTM requirements. Then in the second paragraph, he says that a fail, one explanation might be the compromise in the SA, the settlement agreement. Do you see that?
Yes.
Had you understood that the settlement agreement was going to contain a derogation from the published guidance SHTM 0301?
I knew it did have derogations in it because I had the derogation from the 6 to the 4 air changes. It also had a derogation for Locranza around neutropenic patients. So I was aware that, yes, there were some derogations within it.
But did you think there were any derogations from published guidance in the settlement agreement in relation to critical care areas?
No.
Thank you. If I could then ask you to have a look at, still in bundle 6, page 181. bundle 6, page 181. And it's the email from yourself to Ms Greer. It's on the 19th of June. It's quite late. It's at 10:36 p.m. in the evening. Like, does that just give a flavour of what's happening at this time? Would it be normal for you to be working at 10:36 in the evening?
No, not normal. I mean, this was an incredibly busy time, and my main focus at this time, along with the commissioning managers, was about getting the area, the hospital, operational for moving in. So we were working long hours, we were working with all the clinical teams, we were helping them in setting up all their areas, making sure that they'd all had their adequate training and things. So it was an incredibly busy time. So yes, the only opportunity often I got to look at my emails was very late at night.
Yes. And I think this comes in the period where you said you're really quite shocked that you're getting this information about the non-compliance with published guidance.
Yeah.
And what you say to Mr Greer is, thanks, Graeme, for this. I'm not sure what the SA said and different requirements to the HTMs. From an infection control and facilities perspective, I'm pretty sure they would want the results against the SHTM. Do you see that?
Yes.
What did you mean by that?
I think I meant that I didn't have instant access to the SA, so I couldn't recall exactly what was in it, but that we would absolutely want the results against the SHTM.
Yeah. Because again, if we just think back to some of the procurement documents that we looked at when we gave evidence before, really what NHS Lothian had said throughout is what they wanted was a state-of-the-art facility that complied with best practice guidance. And how did you feel as a clinician to be told that suddenly a few weeks before the hospital was due to open, that wasn't what had been built?
It was incredible. I would say I was shocked, and it was very disappointing.
If we still look within the email of the 19th of June, just the penultimate paragraph, you say, also wonder if for the avoidance of doubt, we just need to re-emphasise the importance of this external validation and implications of test fail, exclamation mark. Do you see that? Mm-hmm. What did you mean by that?
I think just I was highlighting that the potential implications of this were going to be very significant.
In simple terms, what did it mean?
I suppose in simple terms, it potentially would mean that the hospital wouldn't move.
How did you feel about that at the time?
Again, disappointed, angry, I suppose. I mean, that probably became more angry as it went on, and it became, because I suppose at this point, we still didn't know for certain that there were, because initially a lot of the kind of, from memory, the things that IOM were highlighting were initially from theatre, and they weren't at that point saying it wasn't anything that couldn't be kind of resolved relatively quickly. But I think as the days went on, it started to become more and more concerning.
Now, IOM put in their report, which says on their interpretation of the guidance, there was non-compliance. Were you aware that on the IHSL multiplex side that Mr McKechnie of TUV sued, he didn't accept that and maintained that actually what had been designed and built fully complied with published guidance? Were you aware of that?
Not at the time, no.
Okay. And subsequently, was Mr McKechnie's view communicated to yourself and other members of the project team?
Not that I recall, no.
Okay. So, again, if it's not something that you know about, but you weren't aware that there was effectively two schools of thought, IOM on the one hand saying what's been designed and built doesn't comply with published guidance, and Mr McKechnie's view saying, actually, in his view, it did comply with published guidance. You weren't aware of that?
I wasn't aware of his view, no.
If we move slightly forward in the chronology, after IOM come in, various discussions take place, and the next major step would be high value change notice 107, which was effectively to make sure that the critical care rooms did comply with published guidance. So there was going to be positive pressure and 10 air changes per hour. Is that correct?
Yes.
But I'd like to just take one step back from that, really to try and understand what the clinicians and infection prevention and control specialists are discussing in the period before that definitive decision is made that the hospital is going to switch from balanced and negative 4 air changes per hour to 10 air changes per hour and positive pressure. Mm-hmm. Did your clinical colleagues have real concerns about the changes to the pressure regime that was being proposed?
Yes, they did. They did have concerns, in particular the lead consultant. I mean, when it became apparent that there was an issue, as a project team, we went and spoke with the critical care team to try and explain why we thought we were in this position, though we didn't at that point fully understand why we were in that position. But we were very clear that we wanted to be there with them and talking to them and trying and to just kind of so that they were aware of where we were and what was going to be happening. Julie Freeman, who was the lead consultant for critical care, did then go away and, as I recall, read SHTM 0301, and she then sent me an email outlining some of her concerns, and I think they were very understandable concerns, because a few years ago we had been told, by infection control and others, it was right to have positive, negative or balanced pressure, and now we're saying to her, no, you've got to have positive. So on the back of that, I discussed with Donald in Verarity, and we agreed that we needed to meet with the critical care team, which we did do on 2 successive days, to look at that. And also there was practical issues, because there was talk about the positioning of an air handling unit outside part of the critical care unit and what the impact would that be on the actual unit. So we had a meeting over 2 days.
Because if we just think back, the risk assessment that you do in 2017, the key objective is the cohorting of patients. That's what the clinicians wanted to achieve in a safe way. And you'd set out in 2017, refreshed in 2018, that your understanding was that the way to do that was by way of balanced or negative pressure. Mm-hmm. Again, for those of us that don't necessarily understand the differences between balanced or negative pressure, why did you think for cohorting of infectious patients it should be balanced or negative as opposed to positive?
I think because at that time that was the advice. I mean, anything like that we would always go to infection control about, and design advisors, etc., to ask them, and their view at that point was, yes, balanced or negative would be the way forward. And I think, and you may be going on to ask me this, at the meetings that we had with the critical care team, I mean, there was a heavy infection control presence at those meetings, which we wanted to have, because we wanted the critical care team to hear the viewpoint of infection prevention control, and Donald in Verarity definitely took the lead at that meeting, and his view, and it was documented in the note of the meeting, was that neither solution was wrong. So from that point of view, and we spent quite a lot of time, particularly at the meeting on the 11th of July, talking about the types of patients that would be in critical care, the different scenarios, to allow the critical care team to kind of understand the impacts that would have if we change to positive pressure. And at the end of that, they were all comfortable that, yes, that was the way forward and we should follow the guidance.
So if we just perhaps take the pressure, if we leave air change rates to one side at the minute, You do the clinical risk assessment in 2017. Nobody in 2019 is looking back and saying that's a fundamental catastrophic error because to cohort infectious patients you need to do it only by way of positive pressure. No one's having that type of discussion with you. And I think you said really this is just different ways of trying to achieve the same thing. So in terms of a safety perspective from your discussions with both clinicians and also with infection prevention and control specialists, should the inquiry understand from the pressure regime that you can either cohort patients by positive pressure arrangements or by balanced or negative pressure arrangements? Neither is necessarily wrong or unsafe.
That was certainly what infection prevention control were saying, and I would absolutely take their advice.
Because again, it's perhaps issues for infection prevention and control specialists, but to a lay person, it's quite difficult to understand if there's a difference between balanced and negative pressure and positive pressure. They're fundamentally trying to achieve different things. How it could be that it didn't really matter what pressure regime you had in the space, given how much consideration had been given to this by the clinicians from 2017 forward. Can you assist the inquiry with that?
I mean, I do think you are better to hear from infection prevention control, because they absolutely, we would always seek their advice and take their advice, so I think they would be much better to explain it.
So in terms of the discussions that you're having, balanced and negative or positive pressure, neither is necessarily right or wrong, different ways of trying to achieve the same thing. Did all of the discussions really then come down to the fact that there weren't going to be the 10 air changes per hour set out in the published guidance?
Yes.
And what was the significance of that number 10? Why was that so important?
I think it was considered to be so important because that was what the guidance said, and that we should, in a brand new hospital, be complying with guidance.
So that's best practice. 10 air changes, best practice, and it's entirely understandable why in a brand new hospital you'd want to comply with best practice. Was any consideration given at these meetings, though, to whether 4 air changes per hour was unsafe? Unsafe as opposed to simply not complying with best practice?
Not at those meetings, no.
Was there any subsequent consideration of that on the NHS Lothian side?
I think when my recollection was when we were looking, when the problem was discovered, and we were kind of looking, well, what will our options be moving forward? Yes, one of the options was, well, do we just leave it as it is? And there was also, I know there were discussions with IHSL around how much could they increase it without doing too much work, and whether or not there was also discussions around whether or not you could do that work when you were occupying the building. So there were lots of options looked at by different people in different meetings.
And was a view reached in the NHS Lothian side as to whether 4 air changes would be safe or unsafe?
I don't honestly recall if there was.
Okay. One of the reasons I ask is how many air changes were being achieved at the hospital in Sheens?
As I've said before, I'm not an engineer, but my understanding is we didn't have any mechanical ventilation, so there weren't any air changes really being achieved.
And in terms of a clinical and infection prevention and control perspective, was Sheens viewed as a safe hospital for children to occupy?
Yes, it was, yeah. And they did have very low infection rates, so yes.
So again, you might not be able to help the inquiry with it, and it might be for infection prevention and control specialists, but 0 air changes at Sheens viewed as a safe hospital, 10 air changes viewed as best practice. Are you able to offer any view from the discussions you had with your colleagues on the 10th and 11th of July as to why a view was formed that 4 just really wasn't acceptable?
I think it was down to we should if we're going to have to do some works, and I think people were acknowledging we absolutely would have to do some, that you might, as you know, you should go for the best.
So was it quite a simplistic view that the guidance says 10 air changes per hour, we know 10 air changes per hour is safe, that's the standard we want to achieve in a brand new hospital?
Yeah.
Thank you. And again, perhaps just to pick up on some of the detail of the discussion we've just had, if I could ask you to have in front of you, please, Bundle 13, Volume 8, page 593. So Bundle 13, Volume 8, page 593. So that should be an email from you to Donald Inverarity, high importance, on the 11th of July 2019.
Yes.
Where you say, "Hi Donald, can you phone me regarding Julie's emails? And she's also phoned me and she's now feeling very uncomfortable about this and reversing a decision that was made several years ago in conjunction with Potta." Who was Potta?
So that's Potta Kalima. He was the consultant microbiologist who was based at the Children's Hospital.
Thank you. And is very keen to meet to discuss further, which I think we do need to do as a matter of urgency. Do you see that?
Yes.
So is this effectively you recording some of the concerns that have been raised by your clinical colleagues, including Julie Freeman?
Yes.
And we see that email from Julie Freeman just towards the bottom of the page on page 593. We'll see the header, which is Julie Freeman, an email of the 11th of July 2019 at 9:37 to a number of individuals, including yourself. And then we see the detail over the page on page 594, where she states, "Hi Janice and Donald, more questions." And then if we could look to the third last bullet point, please. She says, "The SHTM 0301 for critical care has supply ventilation only with the positive pressure in Appendix 1. Is balanced pressure with both supply and extract ventilation not better than that?" Question mark. Do you see that? Mm-hmm. And then if we look to the final or the penultimate paragraph, she says, "I think it would be helpful to meet to discuss these questions face to face with the same group of people. I know some issues were discussed yesterday, but there was a lot of information to take in. I'm not clear on all aspects on the current situation, is less clear on the planned solution. Inherently, cohorting infectious disease in a positive pressure area does not feel right to me." Do you see that? Mm-hmm. So that's a clinician saying she's read the guidance and it doesn't seem very clear to her, and she inherently thinks the idea of positive pressure just doesn't feel right. Is that the type of concerns that we discussed a moment ago that are being raised by your clinical colleagues?
Yeah.
But throughout the discussions, did there come a point where clinicians such as Julie Freeman were satisfied that actually positive pressure and 10 air changes per hour, they were safe?
Yes.
So did the discussion switch quite quickly, not necessarily to whether balanced or negative was unsafe, but really to whether positive pressure was unsafe?
Yes, I mean, I think their predominant concern was around the pressure regime. I suppose there was less probably understanding about the air changes, but it was about the pressure regime.
And in terms of your clinical college, you tell us within your statement, your understanding and their understanding is that there are certain infectious diseases that actually balanced and negative pressure would be the right way to try to treat those patients. So bronchiolitis or RSV, is that one example?
I think, yes, but I think from recollection, Donald had spoken more about, in a way, it would be more beneficial for a patient who might be neutropenic, who had an infection. So there were very that would be a better scenario.
Just to a lay person reading the guidance, reading what's coming back from your clinical college, it seems like even individuals that work in this space, clinicians, were not finding this straightforward or an easy issue. Was that your understanding?
Yes, I mean, no, they weren't finding it easy to, and I suppose that again it comes down to they're not engineers. They just want an environment that they are told is safe.
Did it surprise you though that there wasn't simple, clear, published guidance from the NHS that was readily understandable by clinicians and infection prevention control professionals as to what you need to do in critical care spaces in terms of pressure regimes and air changes per hour?
Yes, and I suppose the other, the kind of discussions we're having, I think the SHTM 0301 is very much written from an adult perspective. There wasn't really, and there are differences. You have different types of infections in paediatrics. We cohort patients. Certainly, albeit it may have changed now following COVID, but adult critical cares would, I think, very rarely cohort patients. So there are differences, and I think probably it does need to be more explicit.
So in your view, if there was one improvement that could be made to the guidance, it would really be to, as you say, perhaps take the view that for adult patients, all the guidance is broadly single rooms would be the expectation. So unusual that you're going to have cohorting, and that there really should be some specific consideration of the individual needs of children, because it's not as simple as I understand you saying, taking the adult guidance and just saying, well, adults are like small adults, so we'll just apply the same guidance.
Yeah.
I could ask you to move on and look within Bundle 13, Volume 8, to page 554, please. I think I've got you noted as saying that you recollect that there were a series of discussions taking place on the 10th and 11th of July 2019.
Yeah.
Is this effectively, I don't think it's formal minutes, but a note of the discussions that were taking place at this time?
Yes, it was a summary of the discussions that took place, and that were, once they were then sent back out to the clinicians to make sure that everybody was happy with what was noted there.
Okay. So we've got the discussions on the 10th of July, including Julie Freeman, yourself, Janice MacKenzie, and Donald Inverarity, the consultant microbiologist. And then more people are involved in the discussions on the 11th. Again, Julie Freeman, yourself, Janice MacKenzie, and Donald Inverarity. This time, Botta Kalima, the consultant microbiologist that I think had been involved from the email chain back in 2017, is also involved in this discussion now.
Yes.
If we just look slightly below the box, it says, we discussed the current proposals for improving the critical care ventilation to ensure that it is compliant with SHTM 0301, with 10 air changes and 10 PA positive pressure in the single rooms and 4-bedded bays. Do you see that?
Yes.
So again, just reading that note, it seems that very quickly the discussion moves on to simply ensuring that you comply with the guidance, as opposed to looking at whether what is as built is unsafe. Is that fair?
Yes.
Continues, we reviewed the ventilation requirements in the 4-bedded bays to allow you to cohort patients with the same infection. So again, is this still looking at this same overall objective you wanted to achieve back in 2017, which is cohorting sick children effectively?
Yes.
We then see the current proposals that are set out. It then says, see attached markup of the drawing space. And then if we look on to page 555, there's a heading, compliance with SHTM 0301. States currently the 4-bedded rooms and single rooms have 4 air changes, and this needs to increase to 10 air changes to ensure compliance with SHTM. It was acknowledged that the SHTM was more focused on adult critical care, where the patient profile is different and the need to cohort patients was extremely rare. Do you see that?
Yes.
So again, is that the discussion that we've already had, which in your view, it's not as simple as saying, let's take the guidance for adults and we'll just apply that to children?
Yes.
But if you look within the published guidance, SHTM 0301, it's just a generic table. You don't see any specific guidance provided for spaces to be providing care to children, do you?
No, you don't, no.
So is that an added difficulty? You've already told us it's a difficult situation you're trying to manage, complicated in terms of working out the right science for infection prevention and control. But was there this added layer that really there wasn't any published guidance whatsoever specifically related to children?
Yes, and it was something that the clinicians from critical care were concerned about, because they obviously knew that the profile of patients was different.
Thank you. The note continues, it was noted that previously a decision had been made to derogate from the SHTM for the 4-bedded areas to allow patients to be cohorted with the same airborne infection, and following consultation with the clinical team and IPCT at the time, the decision was made that these areas should be balanced or slightly negative. The SHTM states that both the 4-bedded areas and single rooms should have 10 air changes and 10 PA positive pressure. Do you see that?
Yes.
It states that there's a decision made to derogate. My understanding from the discussions that we had previously in your evidence is that you didn't think that this was going to be a derogation.
No, I didn't think it was going to be a derogation. I'm not actually quite, I don't know why it specifically says that in.
Because again, if we think back to the risk assessments 2017 refreshed in 2018, the statement there is it must be balanced or negative to comply with SHTM 0301. So why do we see reference there to a derogation? Can you remember who was talking about there being an agreed derogation at this point?
No, I don't remember.
But does that accord with your understanding? Did you think that there had been an agreed derogation by NHS Lothian?
No.
Thank you. We skip the next bullet point and then look to the 4th bullet point. It says, IPCT view was that you could cohort patients with the same airborne infection in the 4-bedded areas that were 10 air changes and 10 PA, and that there is no reason this would result in increased spread of infection. A design of balanced or slightly negative pressure approaches the issue of spread of infection from a cohort from a different direction, but it was agreed that neither approach increases the risk of infection spread, but the SHTM 0301 compliant design has the additional benefit for neutropenic patients who could be in single rooms at 10 PA positive pressure. Do you see that?
Yes.
And again, is that really just what we've discussed previously, which is effectively the discussions boil down to saying you can have an option that's balanced or negative, or you can have an option that's positive pressure. They're just different ways of trying to achieve the same thing.
Yes.
So again, just from a clinical perspective, should the inquiry understand that the design, which had balanced or negative pressure, wasn't, in your view, clinically unsafe in terms of cohorting patients?
Yes.
Thank you. To look to the next bullet point, it states, it was acknowledged that the design of the unit provided additional control measures to prevent the spread of infection and the barriers to transmission. And there's then a range of things, I won't read them all out, but things like bed space. Why was the view taken that balanced and negative pressure, 4 air changes per hour, and all these additional control measures, why wouldn't they have been sufficient as opposed to flipping to positive pressure and 10 air changes per hour?
I mean, you'll always have additional control measures for in relation to infection control. It isn't all about ventilation. There are a number of things that you would also do to prevent infection or to prevent the spread of infection. Sorry, I've forgotten what the rest of your...
It was really just trying to explore why all of these additional control measures wouldn't have been sufficient together with 4 air changes per hour and balanced or negative pressure to safely manage children in the spaces. But I think I took your answer to say, well, yes, there might be these additional control measures, but these are really just control measures that would be in place regardless of the particular ventilation arrangements. Is that correct?
Yes.
Then look over the page, please, to page 556. It's the first full bullet point there beginning, we discussed.
Yeah.
It states, we discussed a number of different patient groups and scenarios in relation to the use of the isolation rooms, single rooms and four-bedded bays, and in light of these discussions and the points above, all agreed that the SHTM 0301 was a safe design for ventilation within the paediatric critical care unit in conjunction with the design of the unit and good practice in relation to infection control measures, which all work together as a package to achieve best outcome for patients. Do you see that?
Yes.
So again, just so I'm understanding things, detailed meeting taking place where you have clinicians, infection prevention and control and estates, all the ideas fully ventilated, and the consensus view is that the ventilation parameters set out within SHTM 0301 for critical care spaces would be safe for the new hospital. Is that correct?
Yes.
Thank you. Lord Bury, I'm conscious that we're just after 11:30 and I'm going to move on to something different. So now maybe a convenient break. I appreciate that Ms MacKenzie's been giving evidence for some time.
We'll take a break, which will be an opportunity for people to have coffee and try and be back at 10 to 12. Good.
You stand.
Carol, do you want to check if Ms MacKenzie is ready? Thank you. Mr McGregor.
Thank you. Ms MacKenzie, just before the break, we were discussing the meeting on the 10th and 11th of July, and effectively the collective decision made that it would be safe to have positive pressure and 10 air changes per hour. The inquiry's heard evidence that that's exactly what was then designed and built for the RHCYP hospital. Should the inquiry understand then from your perspective as a clinician that the hospital will provide a suitable environment for the delivery of safe and effective care now that it has that ventilation regime?
Yes.
In the period we've just been discussing, really the period of 2019, were you aware of any emerging potential issues with the hospital in Glasgow, the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital?
I was aware. I mean, I was aware initially just through kind of press coverage.
And in terms of your knowledge, is that simply through the press, or is this something that would be discussed internally within the NHS between health boards?
I recall that certainly there was contact made with Glasgow to try and get a kind of a bit of an understanding of what some of the issues were, because obviously we were very aware that issues were being reported in the press, but you know how accurate they were or whatever. And so yes, I think we were trying to find out what some of the issues were.
And in terms of that contact, is that contact you're making directly with individuals working at the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital, or is that others? It
wasn't me, so I know that certainly Graeme did, and Ronnie Henderson did as well.
And can you recall what, if anything, were they telling you about potential issues at the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital at this time, 2019?
I think, from memory, it was kind of fairly vague as to what actually. I mean, yes, we were aware that there were issues and potential issues in relation to pigeons and things, because I do remember in one of the walkabouts we had with the IPC team, you know, kind of going into the plant rooms and specifically looking at that, you know, to make sure that that wasn't an issue for us. So we were certainly aware of that, and we were aware that there were issues with water, but kind of again, I don't think we kind of at that time really knew a lot of the detail.
It sounds like from the evidence you've given, it was a fairly high level understanding, but relatively vague in terms of the knowledge that you specifically had in relation to any issues relating to the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital.
Yes, I mean, we did certainly as a commissioning team, and I think it might have been 2018, we did go and visit the hospital, and it was when it was operational, but that was very much to talk about how they had commissioned it to become operational. And we didn't discuss anything kind of related to more technical things.
And as I understand it, you say that you're reading some press reports about potential issues at the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital. You're aware of some of your colleagues having discussions with individuals that are working at the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital, but those press reports, those discussions your colleagues are having, are they impacting on any of the decision making that NHS Lothian has in relation to what to do with the ventilation system when the IOM reports come in?
I don't know that they were specifically at that time. I don't recall that we were maybe any clearer on what the actual issues were.
So should the inquiry understand that this is effectively a background issue, but in terms of the decision-making that the project team are making, any issues at the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital, they wouldn't be front and centre in your mind in terms of decisions that you're making for the critical care rooms at the RHCYP?
From my recollection, yes, I think that was the case from my perspective.
Thank you. That's everything I want to ask you specifically about the project and the timeline. I think that the final thing I'd like to ask you about is really just some reflections that you may have, and also to discuss some things that have happened after the project. I appreciate that you've retired, but given all of the knowledge you've had throughout your career, the inquiry would be interested in any views that you have on certain developments. Now, one of those developments is the creation of a body called NHS Scotland Assure. Do you have any awareness of the work of NHS Scotland Assure?
No, I mean, I'm aware that a body has been formed, but I don't have any knowledge of it, no.
Okay. Well, the inquiry's heard some evidence that the NHS Scotland Assure is going to be a new centre of excellence for the built environment in relation to healthcare settings. And if I could just ask you to have in front of you, please, within bundle 9, and if we could look to page 4, please. This is a document that was produced by NHS National Services Scotland, and it was called a target operating model. So bundle 9, page 4. Bundle 9, page 4. This is a document called the target operating model for the new centre of excellence. And if I could ask you to look on to page 15 within the bundle, please. So page 15, the document setting out effectively, whenever this body was being created, what's the current state, what's happening, and what would the future be? And if we look to the current state, the final point that's noted is to say that one of the current ways of working was silos between professions. Do you see that?
Yes.
Given the guidance that we've looked at, including SHFN, which sets out the whole partnership approach, was your understanding whenever you were working in the NHS in general and on this project in particular, that one of the main problems with the built environment was professionals just working in silo and not speaking to each other?
I suppose in the professionals that I was kind of working, that wouldn't be my experience. So I would say that, we always worked very closely with the IPC team, with our estates colleagues, just in general, every day kind of working, I think, project specific. I think, again, we had very good partnership working with the IPC and clinicians from my perspective. Yet, yes, I would acknowledge less so with the more technical teams and engineers. But I think, it's about what that clinical input is into these. And I think, particularly if you're, looking at clinicians coming to meetings that are, very technical, and actually what is the value of their inputs, I think you need to be clear about that. And I think, it was challenging enough at times for clinicians to have the time to be involved in the design and room layouts and departments. It wasn't that they didn't want to be, but it was very much, they're there as clinicians to deliver care. So I think, it has to be really clear if clinicians are going to be involved in much more technical discussions. I think you probably would have to ensure that they had some form of additional training, but they're not going to be engineers. So, much as we wouldn't expect an engineer to be involved in kind of clinical decision making. So
To maybe just explore that a little. We take the project as an example. So it's a hospital whereby there's one specific set of pressure regimes and air changes for critical care. There's then a change that something different has to happen, different pressure regime, different air changes. The hospital doesn't open and there's millions of pounds of public money that are spent. Would one of your reflections be that the problem was or was not professionals working in silo in the project?
I think that's quite a difficult question to answer. I mean, I think as has become obvious and throughout all of this and the various kind of reviews that were undertaken, the initial problem seemed to have occurred because of an error in the environmental matrix, and I don't think that wasn't down to professionals not working together and working in silos. So I don't know if that would have changed over the course of the project. I don't know if it would, because clinicians wouldn't have known what the right ear changes were.
Because we've looked at a lot of documents whereby you're either working with or copying in Mr Henderson from the States, colleagues from infection prevention and control. So would it be fair to assume that really wasn't the problem in terms of on the NHSL side, individuals working in silo, because the documentation suggests the opposite?
Yes, I mean, I think we did. And the fact that we were all based in the same office made it easier. And I think the other thing is we were very fortunate to have dedicated support of an IPC nurse, and we know from, going to visit other projects that wasn't always the case. So that was a great benefit. Yes, she was also supporting some other projects, but this by far was the biggest, and she spent a lot of time with us. So that was good.
And in terms of solutions, do you think simply taking clinicians and infection prevention and control specialists and making them attend meetings with engineers about highly technical matters, is that how to solve these types of problems?
I don't think it is. I think it's been very clear about what your brief is, what you want to deliver from a clinical perspective. I think if you're clear about that, then, and there is guidance there, then that's what the design team should be doing and should be coming back to clinical teams if they have a query. And that happened on quite a few occasions.
Like in very simple terms, if you had been at a meeting where two engineers were saying it has to be 10 air changes or 4 air changes to comply with published guidance, as a clinician, would you have had anything to contribute to that discussion?
No, I wouldn't have had anything to contribute, because at that point, I suppose, yes, I would have had something to contribute if one engineer was saying the guidance says 10 air changes and another engineer said the guidance, no, it says 4. I would then be wanting to know, well, what's right, and then I would go and seek advice.
One issue I'd be interested in reviews in is Mr McKechnie from TUV Sud. He'll be coming later this week to give evidence. And as I understand matters from his witness statement, his position is whenever he was designing the solution, he wasn't really aware of the particular reasoning behind why certain spaces had to be set up in a certain way. So, for example, cohorting of patients, that wasn't something that he was specifically aware of. Do you remember having any discussions directly with Mr McKechnie or TUV Sud, who were ultimately going to do the design work?
Well, I mean, I suppose when we had the meeting about the need to cohort patients, he was at the meeting and we did explain we wanted to go and why we wanted to do it. So I would say we did tell him.
So from your perspective, this again isn't a scenario whereby all the clinicians and infection prevention and control people knew exactly what they wanted to do with the space, and that's not communicated to Project Co and their subcontractors on the other side. That's not one of the problems in the project.
No, and I think, when we were having as well, the kind of design meetings around layouts and things. The multiplex design manager was there, and she very much acted as a conduit. So if anybody was raising a kind of particular issue that was more of a technical issue, she would take that away back to the multiplex team and their subcontractors, and then come back to us with a response.
Okay, thank you. Now, if we go back to bundle 9, page 15, we see some of the suggestions for the future state. So this is for what became NHS Scotland Assure. And it's the first point states QHB jointly sign off documents on builds and major refurbishments at key stages in the life cycle. Do you see that? Mm-hmm. Do you think having independent external scrutiny would be beneficial for these types of projects like the RHCYP?
Yes, I do.
And in terms of that external scrutiny, do you think that would have to require a joint sign-off as opposed to someone simply coming in and doing a lighter touch check on what was happening?
Yeah, I mean, I think it would need to be a joint sign-off. I suppose my immediate kind of thought would be around the sheer volume of documents potentially that they would have to review if I look at the documents that we had to review. So I suppose it would be about ensuring that they were resourced to do that, and they would have to be scrutinised in the minutiae of detail.
Thank you. And then if we look still in the future state, the final point, it says provide a structured forum that will enable construction professionals and clinical colleagues to work in an integrated manner. Do you see that?
Yes.
Again, correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding from the evidence you've given is that wouldn't really be anything new, because that's exactly what had taken place on the RHCYP project. Is that correct?
Yes, we did, yes.
If we look on within this bundle 9 to page 20, please. You'll see that one of the changes was going to be the joint sign-off of the projects. But if we look to the left-hand side, just to the left of the black box saying inspection, the second paragraph begins, the QHBE will not. Do you see that? Mm-hmm. So it says the QHBE will not operate in an inspection or enforcer capacity. Do you see that? Mm-hmm. So whatever this body is going to be, it's not going to be going in and doing physical inspections on projects, and it's not going to have any regulatory or enforcement role. Do you see any difficulties with that type of approach?
I suppose it's obviously difficult just kind of looking at it for the first time, but my kind of initial thought would be if potentially they're saying they're going to be signing off on kind of documents and things, it would be difficult to know how they were going to do that if they weren't going to inspect.
Thank you. The next document I'd ask you to have in front of you, please, it's in bundle 1 at page 2263. Bundle 1, page 2263. So this is a revised iteration of SHTM 0301. So it came in February 2022, which I think maybe after you'd retired, is that correct?
Several years after, yeah.
And if I could ask you to look to page 2286, please. You see towards the bottom of the page is a bold heading, ventilation safety group. Do you see that?
Yes.
So one of the new concepts that was introduced in SHTM 0301, the 2022 version, was a ventilation safety group. I'll just read out what the ventilation safety group is. So it says the management of the ventilation systems of a healthcare provider should be overseen by a ventilation safety group. The VSG should have clearly defined roles and responsibilities, be part of a healthcare organisation's governance structure, and report to the designated person at board level. It should be led and chaired by a person who has appropriate management responsibility, knowledge, competency and experience. 4.5, the VSG should be a multidisciplinary group and should typically comprise an authorising engineer, an infection prevention and control person, an authorised person for ventilation services, estates, clinicians and specialist departments, personnel from the finance department, other stakeholders and co-opted expertise. Do you see that? So it's effectively for any key decisions relating to ventilation, there has to be this multidisciplinary team. This is a formalised group, but did that already exist prior to this guidance in terms of the partnership approach under SHFN that we've looked at?
I suppose it probably partially existed. I mean, it wasn't specifically around ventilation, but yes.
And do you think the ventilation safety group as a concept is an improvement on what there was before?
I would hope it is an improvement, yes. I mean, because I don't kind of know how it's operating or anything like that, it's difficult to comment on, but you would hope that it would be a forum where if there were any ventilation issues that they would be discussed. I assume it is something that is to be in place irrespective of whether or not it's about a new project, that it's a general kind of thing. So if there are ventilation issues in an existing hospital, it would go to this kind of group, which I would see as a positive
Thank you.
thing.
And I think you've already addressed in your evidence some areas where you think there would be potential areas for improvement and some of the problems that you think occurred in the project. So you've talked about what you called the spreadsheet error, and you think for a clinician that would have been very difficult to spot that. You've said that you think it'd be helpful to have improved guidance, particularly focused on cohorting of children that could be used by clinicians and infection prevention and control personnel. You've obviously worked on the project, had a lot of time to reflect on it. Is there any other areas that you think for these types of projects, which can be very difficult, often once in a career for individuals working on them, that would be beneficial to try to avoid some of the mistakes and issues that resulted in the public inquiry being set up?
I think probably there's something about, I mean, you mentioned the fact that Mr MacKenzie's view was that the design was compliant, so for critical care. So obviously there's a disconnect between the two, so something around how you would prevent that happening in the future. And the only kind of thing that I can think of, it's almost like you need to have a kind of a checklist that, says, for this area, this is the, air changes, this is the pressure, and the design team then have to sign that off, and it's very, very explicit. And therefore then you would hope that error wouldn't happen.
And in many ways, if what you're talking about, that checklist, if that had all been agreed at the time the contract signed, do you think that would have avoided some of the issues that followed later on in the project? I think, yes, and it would have done. Thank you. Ms MacKenzie, I don't have any further questions, but thank you for answering my question. I appreciate this is now the third time you've come to give evidence, so thank you. Lord, I don't have any further questions.
Thank you, Mr McGregor. I have no questions, Ms MacKenzie, but shall we take 10 or 15 minutes just to check that none of the legal representatives wish, if further questions to be asked or to indeed ask them themselves. So, Ms MacKenzie, if I can ask you to return to the witness room, and I would hope that we can find out whether there will be any more questions in about 15 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you.
No questions?
No questions were asked.
There will be no further questions, Ms MacKenzie, and therefore you're free to go. But before you leave us, can I just repeat my thanks for your attendance, your previous attendance, and all the work that is involved in preparing a witness statement. I appreciate it's significant, but you have provided significant assistance to the inquiry, and for that, can I say thank you? But you're now free to go.
Thank you very much.
The next witness is
Next witness is Mr Graeme Greer.
Mr Greer. Good afternoon, Mr. Greer. As you understand, you're about to be asked some questions by Mr. McGregor, who's sitting opposite you. But first, I understand you're happy to take the oath.
Yes.
If you're just remaining seated, if you would raise your right hand and repeat these words after me. I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that I will tell the truth,
that I will tell the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much, Mr. Greer. We'll plan to break for lunch at about 1 o'clock, and I think we'll probably have to ask you to return in the afternoon. Can I ask you maybe to speak a little louder than you would in normal conversation? I'm hard of hearing. The microphone should help, but as I say, maybe a little slower, a little louder than you would normally speak. Thank you. Mr. McGregor.
Thank you. You're Graeme Greer, is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
And you've provided 2 witness statements to the inquiry for the purposes of these hearings, is that right?
Yeah.
And just for the benefit of core participants, Mr Greer's first statement is at pages 3 to 41 of volume 2 of the witness statements, and then the second statement is at pages 3 to 12 of volume 3 of the witness statements. Mr Greer, the contents of those statements will form part of your evidence to the inquiry, and you're also going to be asked some questions by me today. If at any point you want to refer to either of your witness statements, please just do let me know. This is the second time that you've given evidence to the inquiry, and we covered your qualifications and experience at the previous set of hearings. But really just by way of a brief recap on your qualifications and career, you're a qualified civil engineer, is that right?
That's right, yes.
And you worked for Mott MacDonald from 2011 onwards,
Yes,
is that right?
Yeah.
And since May 2022, you've worked for NHS Lothian.
Yes.
And in terms of your qualifications as an engineer, you're a qualified civil engineer, is that right?
Yes, chartered civil engineer, yeah.
As opposed to being a building services engineer or an electrical engineer. Thank you. And during your time at Mott MacDonald, you were engaged as the lead, Mott MacDonald were engaged as the lead technical advisors to NHS Lothian, is that right?
Yeah, the lead technical advisor and project managers for the Edinburgh project.
Thank you. And in terms of your role with Mott MacDonald, you described that as being internal project manager and lead technical advisor, is that right?
Yeah, I there was two main roles. One was the internal project management function reporting to the project director, and then from a project perspective, I led the project management team and led the technical team.
So although you're a civil engineer, should we understand that you're really doing a management function as opposed to doing any of the granular level technical work on the project?
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm going to begin by just asking you some sort of general introductory questions, particularly about Mott MacDonald's involvement in the project, your involvement in the project, and then after that, really look at a timeline of just some documents in terms of the project itself. And I'll really break things up into sort of 4 stages of the project, just so that you know we're going to cover each of them sequentially. So firstly, the period from financial close up until settlement agreement 1, that'll be chunk 1. Then to look at settlement agreement 1 itself, whenever IOM come in and do their reporting, and then finally to look at high value change notice 107 and the period thereafter until the hospital opens. But if I could just begin, obviously we've covered previously in your evidence the role of Mott MacDonald up to the point that the contract's signed. And the inquiry is not really interested in the specific contractual arrangements between Mott MacDonald and NHS Lothian. It's really to try and understand just exactly what was happening in the ground. So just in your own words, can you explain what are Mott MacDonald doing in the period from the point where the contract's signed really up to settlement agreement 1?
So probably categorise it into two main categories. One was the project management team, and then one was the support team. So the project management team was myself, Mo Brown, Camille and Kelly, and the project management team. And I guess in addition to that, there's the support team. Now, the principal support team was David Stilley from an architectural perspective. And David worked closely with Janice and the clinical team in terms of the architectural development and worked with HLM very closely. Beyond that, there was a broader team, so there would have been mechanical, electrical, civil structural, acoustics, aviation, geotechnical, a broad range of services beyond that, where we would be reviewing the project goals design.
Okay, so if we see individuals being copied into emails and we see Camille Kawajacek, is he on the project management side effectively working with you as opposed to being on the technical side working at the granular level of detail?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
And is that the same for Kelly Bain if we see her copied into things?
Yeah.
She's dealing, again, working with you in the project management side as opposed to dealing with the granular technical level of detail. And in terms of if we're talking about mechanical and electrical engineering, would it be Colin McRae that would be dealing with matters on Mott MacDonald's behalf?
Yes, it was. I think there was kind of 3 key folk involved. Colin McRae, largely from a mechanical perspective, Willie Stevenson from an electrical, and further into the construction phase, Douglas Anderson joined the team as well, and he had an electrical background but he had contracted experience as well, so that was very helpful when we were looking at some of the site development.
And you tell us in your witness statements and also in the evidence that you've already given to the inquiry, Mott MacDonald's role, despite being called lead technical advisor, they weren't a shadow design team, is that right?
No.
And they weren't employed to do some form of technical audit of any of the ventilation solutions for the project?
No, they kind of describe it as a sample review, and the reason for that is down to the risk allocation in the contract, and NHS Lothian had employed Project Co to design, build, finance and maintain the hospital over a 25-year concession period, and therefore the onus was on Project Co to do the design and make sure it was compliant, and Motts were supporting NHS Lothian and doing sample reviews. That there'd been a number of issues at the RIE, which meant Mott MacDonald's role was, compared to the other MPDs, it was slightly more, because that was a choice, but it was always done in the context of the overall risk allocation of the contract.
Okay, so you say it's a sample approach that's been done. It's not a sort of audit of absolutely everything. But should the inquiry also understand that in addition to that, Mott MacDonald would provide other ad hoc advice as and when required?
Yes.
So just in terms of how that would work, it's understand the sampling approach during the RDD process. How would NHS Lothian know when they were potentially instructing this ad hoc advice? How did that arrangement work?
I think the biggest element, I think, was probably midway through the construction phase that there was more issues being uncovered from a design perspective. A lot of the issues were appearing on site at that point. So McDonald and NHS Lothian agreed to do some site visit reports. So there was effectively instruction to increase scope via site inspection reports or non-intrusive surveys to try and identify issues as they were appearing on site. So by that point, the design reviews was kind of the site kind of overtaken some of the design reviews. So that was seen as the best way to try and mitigate any issues we were uncovering.
And just in terms of understanding the ad hoc advice, I'm interested in your views in terms of what a technical advisor would be doing. But if we take just another example, legal advice, if we look through the various bundles of papers, McRoberts were NHS Lothian's legal advisors. So if they were asked to advise on a particular discrete issue, we'll see a note or a memo that would be provided with a sort of crisp capturing of the legal advice that was provided. Is that how it worked in terms of the technical advice of very simple instruction with a very simple answer back, or was it a more fluid process?
I think there was occasions where there was specifics. So there was a sump pump issue later on where there was specific reports done to try and mitigate some of the issues we'd uncovered. So that was a specific report that was done. But generally, a lot of the McDonald team and the NHS Lothian team worked very closely together. So a lot of the advice was, I guess, in thinking about the review procedure, an item would be sent to the project management team. Project management team would send that out to the McDonald technical team and the NHS Lothian technical team. There'd then be the comments would then be collated, and then there'd be a discussion about the actual final questions that were issued. So there was a very collaborative approach in terms of developing the responses.
In terms of that collaborative approach, do you think that there was perhaps a blurring of lines as to just exactly what McDonald was expected to do? Not in the context of the overall project risk allocation. No, I think again, these were sample reviews done in the context that Project Co were the designers and had the responsibility of ensuring compliance. This was just an extra set of eyes. I think, if you compare it to some of the other NPDs, I wasn't heavily involved in other NPDs, but understand there was a much lighter approach undertaken in terms of the review procedure there compared to the approach that Lothian adopted. Again, back to the RIE issues, they were concerned and wanted to at least have some eyes on the Project Co design. So I think you were very clear in your own mind about what McDonald's role was in terms of light touch sampling approach for the reasons you give, that all the design risk is being pushed onto Project Co. Do you think that relatively limited role for McDonald was understood by the people that were working on the project from the NHS Lothian side? So really the project managers, Brian Curry, Ronald Henderson, or do you think they thought that you were providing much more advice than you thought you were providing? No, I think
Brian and I discussed it extensively in the construction phase, and it was very clear the role we were doing, and we didn't want to confuse the risk allocation of the contract by doing anything more.
One thing I'd be interested in your views on is, obviously you say there's this light touch sampling approach, but if the whole ethos behind the NPD structure is to push all the design risk onto project company, why do a sampling approach at all?
I think it's back to that RIE issues. It was a choice that Lothian made. I say compared to the other NPDs that there was more scope. I think the other NPDs, it was quite often done by the estates team themselves, with maybe like sort of a specialist input like energy modelling, which they wouldn't be able to do in house. So I think there was a conscious choice to just do more than the basic, but not confuse the overall.
And how did McDonald work out what samples they were going to look at? You tell us in your witness statement that there's vast amounts of information that are coming in. So in terms of trying to work out what is and isn't important for that sample review, how did that process work? It
was more for I didn't do any of the reviews myself, so I didn't it would be better for the actual technical teams who did that to decide that. I think they would look at it was any major issues they would try and identify from the reviews that we're looking at.
So just to take one example, there's, I think, a change that you're aware of that you addressed within your witness statement to Guidance Note 15, which wasn't picked up on, certainly by anyone on the NHS Lothian side until much later in the project. Are you aware of that?
Yes, yeah.
So that wasn't something that was spotted by the sample review process, was it?
No. I think it was Kelly after July 19. I think it was Kelly that spotted that change just when we were looking at the post July delay. So yeah, it wasn't something we picked up at the time.
And again, I appreciate that you're not the person doing that technical review, but the inquiries looked at various iterations of the environmental matrix moving between the parties. Quite often things are marked up in red. Is that your understanding of how project company would alert NHS Lothian to changes that they're making to the travelling draft of the environmental matrix?
Yeah, there was a general agreement that would happen. See, that the Guidance Note 15 issue, it obviously wasn't flagged red in terms of that critical care change, but that was done in Excel, so there wasn't a way of automatically changing it. So I could understand if everything wasn't flagged when they did it, but just an error in terms of that flagging, because there was other changes in the Guidance Note changes. There were other changes that were flagged red. But just that one wasn't. But I say it wasn't like a Word document where we can do the document comparison or track change. In Excel, it was harder to do that, and it had to be a manual changing of the text.
So, for example, on a Word document, you could do something like a delta view to make it perfectly clear what the changes were. But there wasn't anything like that done on the Excel that was coming in. No,
I say I didn't do the changes myself in terms of, it was obviously project code did the highlighting, but yeah, I would understand they would have to have done that manually as opposed to an automatic track change.
But again, just so I can understand things correctly, your understanding would be that there wouldn't be any expectation on Mott MacDonald's behalf to do an audit of absolutely every change that's coming in, because ultimately the risk for whatever that change is sits with project code.
Yeah, I think if it was a full audit, you could effect be taking on design responsibility for that, and we weren't set up to do that.
One of the issues that crops up is obviously the change that's made to Guidance Note 15. I'm not asking for any technical observations on that, but there's the change made from effectively tenure changes for critical care rooms to tenure changes for isolation rooms and critical care rooms. Are you aware of that?
Yes.
You obviously became aware of that later in the project. Did you try and work back as to why that had come in and the significance of it? Did you get anywhere with that interrogation?
Yeah, in terms of meeting notes or emails, I couldn't find anything where we discussed it. In the procurement phase, there was a change to Guidance Note 15 related to humidification, and in that instance, there was an RFI was issued to say we want to change the guidance note, and then so an RFI was issued. That was then discussed, and the changes were agreed. I couldn't find anything along those lines for this guidance note.
And again, you're very clear in your statement in terms of saying, well, the environmental matrix, that's a project co-document that's to be developed. You'll be aware that the project company's position is really quite different to that. They say that environmental matrix that was given to them was a fixed brief that they had to comply with. Are you aware of that?
Yes.
It's just perhaps one thing it'd be helpful if you could address the inquiry on is, if your view is wrong and Project Co's view is right, how could Project Co be making changes to the guidance note if it's a fixed brief?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think it's a wee bit contradictory. And later on, about July 16, a derogation was submitted. So it was WW14, WW15. So that was seeking relief from compliance with SHTMO 301. So I think there was an understanding, but there was a bit of a confused picture, because in some cases there was Project Co were saying it was as per the reference design, or it was signed off through the review procedure, but in other instances they were issuing changes to the compliance, so it wasn't consistent.
Thank you. One of the other documents that crops up a lot in terms of aspects of the inquiries is published guidance including SHTM 0301. And presumably you'll be aware of that now, even if you weren't aware of it at the time. I don't want to get into the specifics of what that guidance says, but was your understanding that Mott MacDonald were responsible for advising NHS Lothian in terms of whether there would be compliance with that published guidance?
They'd certainly be part of the review. So yeah, there would, if there was readily apparent, clearly obvious issues, then that would get flagged in terms of compliance with 0301, and that would get flagged by the team, I would assume, yeah.
And there came a point in the project, we'll look at the detail of this afternoon, but there came a point in the project where there's effectively a standoff between NHS Lothian on one side and Project Co on the other in relation to the pressure regimes for around about 20 rooms that are going to be in the hospital. One side says it has to be balanced or negative to comply with SHTM 0301. The other side says it has to be positive to comply with SHTM 0301. Is that something that Mott MacDonald are giving NHS Lothian, this type of ad hoc advice that we've talked about? Is that one example?
Yeah. And so just the context to that is, say the WW14 were issued, WW15, that was about July 16. That was to do with that was a single bedroom request for a derogation, but the conversation then developed into what's happening in multi-bedroom. I understand Project Co's position was that there's 20 multi-bedded rooms in the facility, and Project Co's position, the 20 multi-bedded rooms were classified as a general ward, and that general wards, that's in Table A, Appendix 1, Table A1 of 0301. And that general ward criteria had 6 air changes, but it was I don't think it was positive. I think it was silent, so that the table's silent on pressure regime as opposed to positive. NHS Lothian and Mott MacDonald looked at that initially, and I think the first view was it should be the same as a single bedroom, so 6 air changes, negative or balanced. Project Co said that the single bedroom didn't apply, it was a general ward that applied, so we looked further, and it was clause 2.60 of the SHTM was what we looked at, where it said for specialist ventilation requirements refer to the ADB sheets. So I think it was Kelly asked the NHS Lothian team if we could get the ADB sheets for the 20 multi-bedded rooms, and we got, so the multi-bedded room ADB sheet was provided. And when we looked at so that's from the template ADB sheets, when that was provided, that had 6 air changes, negative or balanced. And then that was the essence of the disagreement in terms of air changes and pressure regime.
But should the inquiry understand that whenever this dispute kicks off between the two parties, Mott MacDonald are giving NHS Lothian specific advice in terms of what the requirements of SHTM 0301 are?
Yes.
And they're giving that presumably at a relatively early stage. There then comes a point where there's going to be a potential litigation about this issue. Is Mott MacDonald still involved at that stage?
Yes.
Because you provide an affidavit that could potentially be used in the court litigation, is that right?
Yes, that's right.
And then there is an agreement that's then documented within Settlement Agreement 1, is that correct?
That's right, yeah.
And should the inquiry understand that in terms of the Settlement Agreement 1, Mott MacDonald is advising in terms of whether the solution set out within that document complies with SHTM 0301?
In terms of item 7, it was quite a specific. I think generally speaking, we discussed it with Lothian, and there's a lot of detail later on about this. But there was I was very concerned about the risk transfer in terms of Settlement Agreement 1. So it appeared to me from the drafting that I saw from the technical perspective that it was altering the risk significantly from Project Co being responsible to Lothian being responsible. So we discussed potential mitigation measures. So by that point we were into a speedy RDD process, so we only had, I think it was 5 days to do the review. The team had 5 days to do a review instead of the usual 15. So we looked at option 1 was just carry on as we were. Option 2 was based on what we thought was the revised risk allocation, increase Mott's scope to try and give additional assurance, or the third option was actually Mott MacDonald do the design themselves and take the design liability. But at that point, there wasn't the time or appetite. The commercial situation, the project was in serious distress by that point, and there wasn't the appetite to do options 2 or 3. So we carried on with option 1 and did the best we could.
So we'll come on and maybe look at that a bit more detail, because I think it maybe helps to look at the detail. But should the inquiry understand, when we get to the point of settlement agreement 1, and there's a technical schedule that effectively encapsulates the critical care rooms, the 20 rooms that are in dispute, they're going to have positive pressure and tenure changes per hour. Is the wording in there, is that drafted by Mott MacDonald?
It varied. So in terms of item 7, again, it would have been a collaborative approach between McRoberts, ourselves, and the NHS Lothian team. And generally would have gone through, similar to the RDT, that would have gone through myself and the project management team in terms of managing the flow of that information. And yeah, we would have been involved in the drafting.
And in terms of advice, are Mott MacDonald advising NHS Lothian that what's encapsulated within that technical schedule of settlement agreement 1, that complies with SHTM 0301?
We not specifically, no. Again, back to that, we said we couldn't actually provide that advice. But back to that email I was referring to, we offered, I think Brian, I sent an email to Brian saying we were really concerned about the change in risk allocation. And Mott MacDonald wasn't in a position to take that design responsibility, and we didn't think the project team was either. So Brian escalated that to the NHS Lothian execs, and I think we got comfort at that point that the risk allocation wasn't changing. So things settled down a bit at that point. But latterly we saw further documents where again it looked like the same principle applied. And that's when I started to offer additional risk measures in terms of offering more detailed reviews of the design to give more comfort, or actually doing the design ourselves to give the full comfort.
And again, Mr. Greer, to be clear, it's no part of the inquiry's task to work out any legal liabilities on any party. So I'm not going to ask you any questions today about what a contract means or whether anyone has any liability. I'm simply trying to understand practically what happens. But am I right in thinking that Mott MacDonald are involved in the drafting of the technical schedule to settlement agreement 1? Is that
Yes,
right?
Yeah.
But your view would be that although Mott MacDonald are involved in the drafting, they're not taking responsibility for the design element that's encapsulated within the technical schedule. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And your position is that's because you've already told Brian Curry, the project director, that you're not a shadow design team and you're not going to be taking on design responsibility.
Yeah, without doing additional reviews, we couldn't take on design responsibility.
And Mr. Curry's aware of that. He escalates that, and you're told, well, that's fine. Let's just make the best of a difficult situation and proceed.
Yeah, and again, I think the context is important. Again, from the project was in serious distress there from a commercial perspective. We were the original completion date, I think, was 3rd of July 17, and the unitary charge effectively still needed covered. So, and that was passed down liquidated damages to Multiplex. So that there was a serious commercial pressure on the project, but also in the context, Project Co were providing assurance the design was okay. So I think Lothian would need to take a view, but I think they took comfort from the fact that Project Co were providing assurance that the design was okay, and on top of that, there'd been a number of eyes that looked at the settlement agreement.
So just in terms of that context, what was your understanding at this time about the financial standing of IHSL, the project company?
I don't know the date. I just knew from the conversations I'd heard that it was significant pressure on Project Co and Multiplex.
And what do you mean by that significant pressure? What do you mean by that?
I think the liquidated damages were around about 350k a week, and we were a number of weeks beyond the original completion date.
So in simple terms, are we talking about risk of insolvency here for Project Co?
I don't know that. That's beyond my
Was there any discussions taking place like that with other members of the project team, Brian Curry, Ronnie Henderson, about the financial standing of IHSL at this time?
It was mentioned in passing, but I say it wasn't. It was more of a.
So what were they telling you in passing?
It was more. It was probably more an EY McRoberts type issue. They were looking at the. I think it happened. I think the crunch time was about 18 months after the original completion date. I think that was when there was some sort of trigger in the contract, which could have caused additional issues. But I say I wasn't that close to the detail of it. I was just aware there was significant distress and commercial pressure.
So your understanding at the point that settlement agreement one's being drafted, that there's really significant commercial pressures that mean a deal has to be done?
Yes.
Thank you. If I could now just perhaps move on, Mr Greer, and look at some of the detail, and really I'll sketch out a broad timeline from 2018 right up to high value change notice 107, just to try and understand what's happening at various points in the project. So if we could begin, please, by looking at Bundle 13, Volume 5, at page 1097. If we could look down, I think this is some entries from the ACONX system that you might have been familiar with. And if we could take matters up approximately halfway down the page, there's the RE G1547 RDD review environmental matrix. Do you see that?
Yes, yeah.
And this is from Camille Kawajacik, and it's to Ken Hall. And then if we perhaps just look over the page onto page 1098. It's about halfway down. The final paragraph begins, IHSL are also reminded. We can zoom in on that. Do you see that?
Yes.
And it says, IHSL are also reminded that the reference design has no relevance to the current contract, and IHSL are to comply with the project agreement, and in particular the BCRs and the PCPs. Any non-compliance with the BCRs or PCPs should be highlighted to the board. Do you see that?
Yes.
Why would Mr Kawajacik be including that standard language at the end?
I think there'd been a number of meetings by that point where the reference design had been mentioned. In terms of, I think there was kind of two themes that came through. One was the design is as per the reference design, and the second issue was NHS Lothian have approved the design through the review procedure, and if I think the implication thereby that the board had design liability. So yes, that was two. So there was quite often. I think this issue went more or less right the way through to July 19. In some ways, there was still conversations going on then about this, and yes, it was a theme that ran through the course of the construction phase.
And in simple terms, is this one of your colleagues simply reminding Project Co that all of the design risk sits with them,
yes,
and that just because there's some comments coming back, they shouldn't think that this is an agreement or a derogation from the contractual liabilities?
Yes, yes.
Thank you. Lord Brady, I'm conscious that that's just turned 1 o'clock. That may be a convenient place to take a break.
Yes, we'll take our lunch break now, and if I could ask you to be back for 2 o'clock, please, Mr. Greer.
No problem. Thank you.
Son.